Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Mathematics in Context marking guidance. So today, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the general information that the exam papers have that will help the students ensure they provide correct working out and answers and stuff, and so they know how things are going to be marked. Some general marking guidance which will be similar to what you will see in GCSE and A-level marking. Again, it's the maths in context has its own structure for marking. There might be similarities to ones, but it's not going to be identical to either of those. And then once we've done that, we'll look at some examples for questions from 2023 and 2024 with some student responses and see where they gained and lost marks and why from the comments from examiners. So hopefully this afternoon will clear some things up for you. If you have access to the papers and the mark schemes to hand, that could be useful. I will be displaying some mark schemes for certain questions. But if you want to have those mark schemes and papers up for these 2 years, please do so. But if you don't have access that right way, don't worry too much. Okay, so let's first of all just look at the general information about the exam that's on the front of the papers. So we ask students to use a black ink or ballpoint pen and make sure to try and answer all the questions. They can use calculators. They're going to try to make sure they keep their working in the space provided, because you remember, just the same with GCSE and A-level, their answers will be snipped. And if they have work writing outside of the answer area, there's a chance that it could be out of clip, which is normally referred to in marking. If the marker does feel that there's some work which is outside of the clip, they normally refer that to the team leader and then they can investigate further. But if we try to make sure students do write all of their answers in the spaces provided and do not go outside of those lines, there's a better chance that everything is going to be marked accordingly. This is also very important information, so make sure the students do read this. So we've got the fact that each paper's got a different amount of marks. So paper 1 is 60 marks, paper 2 is 80 marks. They've got to make sure they read each question carefully, checking all their answers, because if they don't check, they could easily have an easy slip. And part of that is making sure their answer makes sense and is in context. There'll be times when it'll ask for a contextual response, and they've got to also make sure that it makes sense. So, for example, if the question involves like a mobile phone bill and they get an answer of say £14,000, that's not sensible. They potentially made a mistake. It could just be a decimal place issue. It could be a slight calculator issue, but they should be doing that just to make sure that their answers are sensible. Okay, so let's now look at some general marking guidance. So all candidates will receive the same treatment. So every single question will be marked in the same way, the first and the last. All the mark schemes will be applied positively. The examiner should mark according to the mark scheme and not just based on what they think and the perception of the grade boundaries, and there's no ceiling on achievement. All the marks are designed to be awarded. Okay, and if the answer matches the mark scheme, they will get those marks. And they should always award full marks if it's deserved, but also be prepared to award 0 marks if the response is not worthy of any credit. Where there's any judgment required, mark schemes will provide principles in which the marks can be awarded. There's always going to be examples and notes. Okay, if there's any doubt regarding to applying the mark scheme, then they can consult their team leaders. Crossed out work will be marked unless it has been replaced with an alternative response, even if it's like one number. So the mark schemes will normally show the main solution. So the solution just be the most common, but it will also show alternative methods if necessary. Okay. If the examiners are not sure if it's acceptable, again, they will refer to their team leader. When it comes down to multiple responses, if there is an obvious choice, okay, the candidate has put their response in a particular space and circled it and made it clear that that is their answer, then that's the one that will be marked. If there is not an obvious distinction between two different solutions, the examiners will mark all methods, but they're all the lowest scoring method. That's similar to GCSE marking. The misreads, if it does not alter the character of the question, then it will be marked accordingly. Okay. The transcription errors, if we see a correct solution, but then it potentially is then incorrectly transcribed somewhere else, then we can still award all the marks as long as it doesn't simplify things too much or it doesn't change something. But if they've worked out correct solutions and then somewhere else they've done a transcription error, we can still award the mark for the correct solution in the original place as long as it was used properly. Again, this can be referred to the team leaders and they can double check this. So again, the type of marks available are again very similar to GCSE marking. So we've got M for our method marks, got our accuracy marks, got our unconditional marks, which are our B marks, and we've got communication marks. And there are lots of different abbreviations, which you may have seen before. So we've got follow through. Again, we'll see some examples of that as well. CAO is for correct answer only. For ignore subsequent working, it could be a case of that a fraction may be required. And if they simplify that fraction incorrectly, but it doesn't affect something they're doing later on, they won't necessarily lose the marks. Special case could be where they've done there's a particular type of thing they might do, which is not necessarily correct, but it could be a case of it's still worthy of some marks that will be noted in the notes somewhere. There will be dependent marks. These are normally method marks that are dependent on previous method marks. And obviously we've got our shorthands for rounding. So now we'll look at some examples. We've got some from the 2023 papers and we've got some from 2024 as well, with some responses, and we'll better see what marks those responses got. So we'll start with this question from 2023. So this was a question which involved setting up some equations, simultaneous equations here. We've got information provided in a table, and candidates had to work out the cost of one packet of type A medication and the cost of one packet of type B medication. So they got a mark for setting up the equations. They got a method mark for a correct method of elimination. The second method mark you can see was dependent on the first one. So that was for a complete method to find the other variable. And then the communication mark was having both correct answers. So the amount for type A and type B. So here we've got an example of a transcription error. Okay, so we see here, the student didn't actually write the equations themselves. They just used the table, but they've done it correctly. We can sort of see that their working out is implied by these ×3 ×2 information here. So they got the B1 mark for the implied equations, and you can sort of see they did also do the elimination method. So we can see it's done. It's been implied, so they did get those 2 marks. So they haven't got to write out the equations if it can be seen done in another way. For example, they could use like a bar model, all sorts of ways they could do these sorts of things. As long as it's implied that they've formed equations of some sort, whether it be from a table or from some other diagram, it's all okay. We also see that we've got the answer 1.34 here, and they've substituted that correctly to then get the correct value for type A. But what they've then done is they've written 1.35 instead here. So they've got the answer 1.34 and the correct answer 1.12. So they are the correct. So they've got that mark, even though they had this transcription error. Because we could see they got the correct solution and then they substituted that solution correctly to find the other value as well. Here's another response. So we can see here that they've written equations. However, they've made an incorrect attempt to eliminate. So they've done, for some reason, they've decided to multiply the first coefficient by 2 and the second one by 3. So rather than sort of multiplying the whole equation by an amount, they've muddled up their multiplications here. So do not get that method mark and therefore cannot get the second method mark because it was a dependent one. So even though they've subtracted these equations, they cannot get that because it's a dependent mark. Okay. And therefore their answers are also incorrect. So another question for 2023. This is question 4 involving Venn diagrams. I'll read that question first. The students will need to complete the Venn diagram, describe in context a particular set, and then using set notation, describe the set from the words, and then again describe in context the shaded region. And the second part of the question here, or part C, I'm afraid, sorry, is a tree diagram. And in part D, they've got to assess the company's claim. So here's the mark scheme. And you can see in the notes the sort of notation that's allowed for set notation. And that communication mark bottom, the different options that are allowed. Response. So again, it's important to note that handwriting is a very important thing to talk about with your students. If the handwriting is difficult to read, it can be difficult for the marker to do it, and they will struggle to necessarily, they may not give the marks that the student thinks they are worthy if they can't read their handwriting. If it's unclear what they're writing, they can't necessarily mark it. You can see here that the Venn diagram is correct. So they will get all 3 marks of part A. They get the communication mark for BI, but then for the second part of B, the notation is incomplete, it's not correct, so they cannot get that one. Their response for part 3 was correct and in context, so they get that mark. What's the in part D? So again, important here, they got the mark for the values on the tree diagram. Okay. That's all fine. Now the other values that we will need to get from this tree diagram that will involve some working out, some calculations, and we can't see those calculations. However, there's some implied marks given because we can sort of see there's correct values being used for part D. Okay, so we can, if the values that they provide are correct and they haven't shown working out, it's implied that they know the correct working, therefore we can give those marks. Another response to the same question. So again, the Venn diagram is correct. Part B, they do not get the first mark because that is incorrect. For the second part, they decide to put up a P for probability, so that's incorrect, so they cannot get that. And it also uses the union rather than intersection. They've used an acceptable description, therefore they can have the mark for the part 3. They've got their tree diagram correct. Again, there's no working out shown, but because we've got the correct values there, again, they're implying that those values are correct. And in part D, they've got all the marks are awarded. They've used some correct figures and they have explained it correctly. So we need to be careful that we tell students to be a bit more careful showing their working out. If they were to write some stuff that had a wrong figure there, they're going to lose quite a lot of marks. So let's try to make sure we drum that into students that they do show plenty of working out. So now I've got a question from 2024. So we've got a scatter graph. Students need to plot the final 3 points. They would have to be referred to data source A as well for this. They've got describe a relationship shown by the scatter graph. And then for part C, they've got to use their scatter graph to answer the questions. Here's the mark scheme for that question. See that for part C2, they get a method mark if they draw a line of best fit, but also if they don't draw a line of best fit, they can do it for plotting a point or showing some other form of working out to get that method mark. So his response. So they've only actually plotted one of the 3 points correctly, so they do not get the first mark. They do, though, get C1 for a valid description stating positive correlation for part B. The last part of the statement is condoned as it is thought to be talking about the correlation coefficient. It mentions close to 1 here. So obviously that's something they all do as well in the exam. So they've used their knowledge of that to answer that. So that was allowed. C and D. So you can see, again, I've got the notes there as well. They've got the B1. The answer of 31. And for part 2, 27 is within the range. So it's between 24 and 28. There was a line drawn from y equals 10. So there wasn't a line of best fit drawn on the graph, but there was a line. So that method was a clear method to help them find out this estimate. So they got that mark. The part 3 is not a correct statement and a bit contradictory, so they don't get that communication mark. And also they do not get the mark for part D. Another question from 2024, question 2 from paper 1. They'll be given a table to complete to work out the standard deviation. we've got to compare again in context the percentage of colonies lost during the winter 2020-2021 with the percentage of colonies lost during the summer 2020 in those 42 states. So again, contextual response is required. You can see we've given them plenty of opportunity to use the table here. So I want to try and make sure that they are using all the space on the table provided to help answer those questions. So here's a response. So they didn't give a midpoint column, but they did get M1 for finding at least 2 of the products. So the 225 and the 560 imply that mark. And we can also see the 225 times 25 is seen as further working once the 225 was calculated. So we can see stuff in there. Okay, so they've written the midpoints on the actual first column there. So they don't have to use all of the columns provided. Yeah, ideally, they can show it nice and clearly if they use more columns. The second mark is awarded for finding at least 2 of the products of fx squared. Again, we can see some values there that help confirm that. The next method mark is dependent on the previous method mark, and this is for the 4 method, and it is therefore it's not awarded here. The value of n in this example is 4 and not 42. That's one of those common exceptions that, rather than having the total frequency, they've used the sort of number of groups. Therefore, they cannot award the final accuracy mark. Part B, they've allowed a follow-through mark. So that's been applied, and the students are awarded the marks are correctly comparing their answer to part A with the figures in part B. So even though they got their answer incorrect, a follow-through mark is allowed, and they're compared theirs correctly. Okay, and it's also given in context, so they can award both marks. Another question from 2024, which is paper 2, question 2. So again, they've got to refer to data source B in the source booklet, and I've got a little image of that there. Just got to make sure they can read from the values in the data source to answer the question. So we've formed 2 equations, so they have got the 2 method marks. The value of A is found and then used to evaluate B, so they get another method mark. And they have clearly communicated the answers which are accurate, therefore they get the accuracy mark as well. In this response, we can see that there's a misread. So what they've done is instead of using 4,000, they've used 400. Okay, and that was judged as a misread. So they've awarded a method mark, but because the final answer is incorrect, they cannot give the accuracy mark. So it's noted here that if the misread, if that would simplify the skill required, then it wouldn't be allowed. Okay, but just changing it from 4,000 to 400 doesn't actually affect the skill required. So they can get a mark for that. There's a similar sort of question, but from 2023. So here again, referring to data source C. This is about money that footballers earn. We've got a formula here. And the important thing here is that V is the transfer value in millions. Okay, and we can see in the actual text, we've got our transfer value of 45 million, where million was given in words. So we want to make sure they know what value to substitute into the formula. Okay, we need to be using 45, not 45 million, but 45. Now, in this response, they've written the word 45 million. Right, so written the figure's 45, but then written the word million. So they have extracted it correctly from the data source. So it was deemed that that was allowed. So they allowed the method mark for that. Okay, for writing 45 with the word million. They allowed that and gave them that method mark. However, the accuracy mark was not given. Okay, the answer needed to round to 245,000. In its next response, we can see they've actually substituted in 45 million numerically like that. Therefore, they do not get that method mark. Okay, because they did not use 45, they used 45 million. Obviously, they don't also get the accuracy mark. Next question is from 2024 again, which was question 7 from paper 2. So here's part A and part B. Series going on there. So here's a response. So they've got to write down the value of D. They've written 300. They've got that correct. State one assumption that Anchor has made. They've said that each year there is the same proportion of number of single-use plastic bags in millions. That's very ambiguous. Okay, using the word proportion doesn't really make sense in that. So it's not about that. It's about the fact that it's going to increase by the same amount each year. So they did not get that communication mark. Next response is part B here. Sorry, yeah. In part B, we've got that the M1 is awarded because they've used 9 as N in the formula and D is 300. They've got the correct answer. And then we've also got the next method mark awarded as well, and they've got the final accuracy mark as well. Okay. So they don't need to write the word million there. They've written 9,200 and put millions in brackets. Here, because it's in brackets in the mark scheme, it means it's not necessarily, it doesn't need to be included to get that mark. Okay, so they just need to have 9,200. Same for the second one, just needed to have the 72,000. Another response to that same question. So they do not get the first mark, they've not got the correct value of D. And also the communication mark is not given because that's not correct. Part B. For part 1 of B, they get the method mark and accuracy mark. You can see here that the incorrect working is crossed out and then replaced. But even if it had been left as the final answer, we would have awarded follow-through marks. Okay, so if they had not corrected the answer, they would have got follow-through marks if they'd used that. Okay, it has a little FT in the mark scheme, so that's why we can use it. For the second part, they've used the figures for several years and then given the final answer of 2000. This is acceptable. It's a slower method, but it is suitable. So it will get the marks. Okay. Next question was question 10 from paper 1, again from 2024. We've got a graph describing it's a model of the revenue over a period of years. Students need to state what a function would be good to represent that model, and then they have to estimate a gradient and write what that is in context, and then they need to calculate the compound annual growth rate using that formula there. Here's the mark scheme for that question. Again, we've got examples of suitable functions such as exponential or geometric was okay, or they even allow a growth function. So I need to draw a tangent for part B. Again, examples for explanations for part B2. And we're looking for 49% for part C. So they haven't answered part A, so no response to that, therefore no marks. They have drawn a tangent at y equals 2015. They've got a complete method for the gradient. It's nicely annotated. The reason accurate, therefore they can award the marks. Okay, that answer was within the range. The range was 8 to 12.5. They've got 10.38. So they've got a mathematically correct explanation of what gradient represents, but it's not in context. So they cannot have that communication mark. Okay. Part C, they have used correct values, so they do get the independent mark for that, the B mark, and the method is fine. And they can also get the final accuracy mark because we were looking for 49%. Okay, so that rounds to 49, so that's all good. So that was the last of our examples. So let's now summarize some important things. So it's important that anyone marking these papers looks carefully again at the marking principles, which should be at the start of the mark schemes. Okay. There will be several methods provided in the mark schemes. Be prepared for different approaches. So even though alternative methods are provided, if they haven't set something out exactly the same as what it might be in the mark scheme, if the method is implied or equations are implied with correct values, then that could be worthy of method marks and accuracy marks. We need to make sure that the accuracy is within the required range, or at least will round to the correct value. Okay, and look out for follow-through marks, because we do make sure that we compensate students for correct methods, even if they potentially had an incorrect answer previously, so they can be awarded some marks. So if you do have any other questions regarding this or anything else, remember you can contact your subject advisor. You can contact the Emporium team and ask questions. And if it's a question they might need to ask, maybe the chief examiner, they will ask them and get back to you when they've got a response. There's also more on the Professional Development Academy. So you can check that out for more CPDs, more Maths in Context CPD and other qualifications. And please remember that your feedback is really important to us. So if you've got any comments about how things can be improved, what you like, what you don't like, please let us know, and then we can ensure that we act on those for future events. Thank you very much for attending today's CPD.